Thank you very much for inviting me. Please feel free to interrupt and ask anything if you want to as we're talking. I hope I'll end fairly swiftly so that we can take some comments. But yes, I'm really, Ben mentioned that I was a colleague at Roehampton, but before I was at Roehampton, I, for many years, was contracted to The Guardian as a feature and comment writer. And for over 10 years, I wrote a fortnightly column on the comment pages. These were the sort of, I just sort of picked up some random pictures of the sort of thing that I used to do, which will become relevant as I'm talking. Because I'm talking about today trends in journalism, and one particular trend about personal journalism. But in 2008, when I was already working at Roehampton, I was asked for advice by the then editor of the family section of The Guardian about covering the issue of dementia. The editor who spoke to me knew that my mother had dementia at the time, and she was looking for some kind of way of reflecting what is becoming, has become quite a significant social problem. And so she asked me if I would be interested in writing about it in some way. In particular, they had on the pages, and I'll have to just these are some of the columns that I did, but this is the family section. They were interested. They had a very successful column on the page at the time called Living with Teenagers, which was anonymous and tracked a sort of a day-to-day account and life with teenagers, and they wanted something rather similar to that with dementia. And I hesitated because I was going through personally quite difficult times at that moment. It was very difficult with my mother. I was the main carer. And any of you who've been through these sorts of experiences will know that these, it can be it's demanding. It creates all sorts of issues within the family. Who's caring, who's not caring, and it's just, and it's quite a sort of painful time generally. And I hesitated over, did I really want to sort of put that out in the public sphere? But actually, when it came to it, the professional journalist came to the front, and I'm afraid I thought to myself, well, if I don't, somebody else will. So I decided to go ahead and write this column. There were sort of, for me, quite issues about whether or not my mother had actually given consent on it. I did say to her at one point, I'm writing about you. And she would say things like, oh, that's good, I'd like to find out about myself. So she had a sort of sense of humour, but I never felt this was authentic consent in the way that journalists ought to get consent for covering certain sort of personal issues. But this was the column that I wrote, and I wrote it for 2 years, every fortnight. It was kind of it became quite enjoyable to do. It was because my mother provided us with endless sort of amusing anecdotes, I have to say. But it was a kind of, to some extent this writing came naturally. Far from being a total departure. I mentioned earlier and showed you a couple of slides that my main writing, as I say, was the main thing I did for The Guardian was for many years the kind of social and political commentary and on the comment pages, which is sort of, serious, analytical, engaging with current affairs, engaging with politics. But at the same time, I'd always taken the approach of including quite personal details in that. I'll just quickly whiz back to there. Oh no, maybe no, okay. No, I haven't unfortunately I haven't got it up there, but I will in a minute. Yeah, that that the columns that I did write, even on the sort of comment pages, were ones which were sort of, where I drew on my own personal life. I remember one column in particular about the selling off of council housing. And I wrote about my own experience of that and growing up on a council. I based it on what had happened to the council estate that I had actually grown up on. But it was at the same time sort of researched and involved and taking on what had happened politically and economically. But the point being that actually, I always did draw on my personal life. And I always found that the columns that got the strongest reaction were the ones where actually I brought my own personal issues into bear. And I think this was particularly significant being female and having been involved in feminist critiques of the media in the 80s, that actually, because feminism had as a strong element of its ethos was actually about the personal is political. I never sort of saw the distinction in quite that way. So this is simply to say that writing the kind of personal journalism that about my mother felt like, although it had a qualitatively different element, which it was much more personal. It involved naming. People had names. I named my partner for the first time in my life. I started referring to him as a character in the column. I didn't ever name my children, but I mentioned them. So people began to feature, real people began to feature. It was much more sort of exposing and personal, in ways that I'd never mentioned having holidays, or apart from doing travel writing or something. But so it was much more personal, but not a huge step of difference. But I think one of the other reasons for hesitating is there's some pretty dubious companions in this kind of writing. Have any of you, presumably some of you have heard of Liz Jones? Yes? Do any of you ever look at the You magazine on Sunday? Yeah, the Mail on Sunday's colour supplement carries her diary, which they originally picked her up from The Guardian, unbelievably, at one point. But she is someone who, if you haven't read her before, it takes personal journalism to another level where everything is exposed, and she doesn't, the kind of delicacy that I've just expressed about did my mother really consent or not, does not concern Liz Jones. She just tells everything, the most horrendous details. This, you probably would make you squirm if I told you what it was about, but it was stealing the discarded condom from her partner because he didn't want to get pregnant and she did, and it's this kind of really horrendous sort of confessional writing. Samantha Brick, some of you may have come across. She's a sort of another who's made a real career out of writing about very explicit aspects of her personal life. This is where she came to attention by writing a piece that drew, enormous responses. Look at the number of comments, and that was before closing time. 5,725 comments about writing about how jealous allegedly how jealous other women are about how beautiful she is. So as I say, there was some sort of. There are some pretty dubious characters occupying this sphere. Yeah. I think, I was aware, because by this point, by by the point that I started writing this column that I was already straddling academia and journalism, and I was aware of the kind of rhetorical contempt with which this confessional writing was held. As I say, there are some pretty poor examples of it, or some rather extreme examples of it, Liz Jones and Samantha Brick, but much more generally, this is a much more general phenomenon. They're at the extreme end, but across journalism in general, you can find this kind of writing. First person, it comes out in a number of different names: real life experience, first person journalism, confessional journalism, true stories. It's very much a staple of features of magazine writing. It's really all over, and it's not just the sort of the tabloid end of things. It's the broadsheets. The Guardian is just as much, if not more than most, actually, very, very much, produces this kind of journalism. And it isn't just, it isn't. Here's, this is typical. These kind of. This kind of first-person confessional, personal writing. This is Marjorie Morris, who's been, I think she's in charge of Mind, talking about her own battle with depression. If you think of it, I'm sure you can all think of examples of picking up a newspaper and reading. At some point, you'll come across this kind of writing, but it isn't just. These kind of, a certain kind of feature writer. You'll find this writing really across the spectrum. Increasingly, the sort of, some of the kind of the most eminent, apparently the most, conventional of journalists are found doing this kind of writing. Here's John Simpson, BBC Foreign Affairs editor, writing about, becoming an elder father. And you can find this, you can find this kind of writing really being done by all sorts of journalists. Alan Rusbridger wrote about the death of his father. Alan Rusbridger, who was the editor of The Guardian, wrote about the death of his father. There was a wonderful piece written by Matthew Engel, who was one of the leading writers for The Guardian, about the death of his son. There was, have you heard of Patrick Coburn? He's the Middle East correspondent for the Independent. Has written absolutely, incredibly moving pieces about his son's having schizophrenia. So again, this is typical. Martin Townsend, another Observer journalist, writing about living with his father with manic depression. I'm basically trying to sort of prove by this that this is a trend. It's a very, very widespread trend. It's very key in a lot of journalism. You may think this is something people do on the side, but in fact it's got a strong presence now in even the most sort of so-called objective, serious, analytic journalism. And I saw these, I saw a very positive side to this kind of writing. As I say, for me, coming from a sort of feminist background, it felt natural, because I always thought, like the other feminist writers, that actually what happened in our private lives, in our domestic lives, actually told a story about what was happening in society. So I think you saw the slide flash by there about domestic violence, for example. But if you think back to the sort of early days of The Guardian women's page in the 70s was really sort of pushing for the coverage of these issues and saying, look, things like rape that people keep quiet about, things like domestic violence that people keep quiet about, these are really important issues, and they have a very damaging effect on people's ability to fulfill their own potential, on women's ability to fulfill their potential. So what's going on privately needs to be brought out into the open. So as I say, I already had a kind of a commitment to these areas, but this kind of writing as well, I felt was very, I felt this was a very positive side, because you saw people being open about things like mental illness, things that, issues that people keep quiet about, don't want to share, and yet everyone, many of us, have had those sorts of experiences. And one of the areas where this has been very, very positive indeed has been on the kind of coverage of cancer. Again, this is probably a bit too early for the students amongst you, but John Diamond, who was a columnist on The Times, who he used to be married to Nigella Lawson, as you can see. He wrote what he used to call a jaunty weekend column, which was basically a sort of slight, what happened in my life this week sort of thing. And then he was diagnosed with cancer, with throat cancer, and he documented the whole process. The same with Ruth Picardy, who only wrote about 6 columns for the Observer before she died, but again had a sort of a huge impact, because it was actually writing about what it feels like to get that diagnosis, what the treatment's like, what goes on. And these things, these people, I think if you talk to doctors now, a lot of the doctors say their whole attitude has changed from having these kind of columns, this kind of writing being done by this personal writing, which actually means that the doctors begin to see the other side, and they change the whole way they have treated cancer patients. So a lot of this kind of writing can be enormously important. And I, I also, I mean, what I think when I began to reflect on this, and as that I realized not just that these were important, these were important subjects in themselves that were being aired, and that personal issues were being aired, but I began to see that when I reflected on, and as Ben mentioned, I've written a book on this, when I began to reflect on the role of the sort of personal voice in journalism, that actually they are fulfilling a really important role in the newspapers and news organisations themselves, not just because of the content and the personal material and the fact that that personal material is important, but also because actually they are personalising the news organisations. That there's a very curious, very interesting phenomenon going on here, which is that actually these writers writing about themselves personally, and identifiable columnists, are ways in which news organisations, which can otherwise appear like the lofty voice from on high, this impersonal voice, the Guardian's view on, the conflict in Syria, this, which is actually, it's fine, we all appreciate it, that's what we turn to get our kind of facts, but actually increasingly in the kind of culture we live in, which is a much more personalised and expressive one, this fulfills a need for the news organisations to be humanised, and that we actually think of the papers almost by papers, sorry to use such an old-fashioned term, but the news organisations as being, as having these people who we recognise and know and have. Yes, Tim?
Well, I was asking you a question. Forgive me if
No, that's fine.
You contrast this with more traditional forms of journalism. And I wonder, doesn't it actually come from them? I mean, isn't this kind of personal journalism actually exactly what the best war correspondents were doing by providing eyewitness testimony from the front? This is eyewitness testimony from the battle against cancer, yes, but it's the way Martha Gellhorn wrote about life in Madrid. It's the way J. Allen wrote about the siege of Badajoz. It's something that the personal journalism has taken from the traditional forms of eyewitness war correspondence and foreign correspondence. Yes.
Okay, no, it's a very fair point, and actually, without wishing to do a kind of plug for my book, well, actually wishing to do a plug for my book, I do actually address this, and I think, I mean, you've sort of helped me move on quite rapidly to what I was going to say, which is that actually, when I did come to study this, because this is the kind of role I recognised as playing. When I came to write this book, Speaking Personally, I looked back historically, and actually, yes, it's quite clear that the kind of, in fact, you know, the really great journalists are always the ones who have this clear voice, this clear presence, this clear subjectivity. The interesting thing is it's sort of got, although it's always been there, and I do talk about this a bit in the book, that there's a kind of, you know, I don't know if it's ever been said to any of the students here, but I've certainly heard it said by journalism tutors that the kind of, what you need to do is to find your own voice. You know, that's the thing, you need to find your own voice. But at the same time, it's slightly schizophrenic, because you have to find your own voice, but in writing sort of, you know, writing according to the kind of very strict conventions of news writing, that shouldn't be a sort of subjective presence. And I think it's got, to kind of come back to Tim's question, I think it's sort of got, you know, there was a period where probably from the 20s onwards, where that kind of subjective voice, although it was always there, someone like James Cameron, for example, you know, who was a great writer in the 50s and 60s, very, you know, very strong personal voice. Although that still went on, there was a kind of repudiation of it. You know, there was a kind of rather strict, particularly coming from America, this kind of, you know, this convention shutting down of the personal pronoun. And that still is true in America to some extent. If you look at America and France and some of those cultures, I remember I got invited to do some things in France, and the French students were sort of absolutely unfamiliar with this kind of writing. They, you know, they just, it was kind of against their conventions. So, I mean, I think that's absolutely true, but nevertheless, because of the legacy of that kind of push towards objectivity and, you know, the abolition of the sort of subjective or the personal pronoun in news, that there is a bit of a sort of legacy of hostility to this kind of writing as being less sort of worthy. And I think where you find some of this sort of, you know, maybe it's unfair to call it snobbery, but there is a sort of snobbery towards this kind of writing that interested me. That it was kind of, if you look in these terms that are often around about, have you heard of people talking about tabloidization or featureization? And there's a kind of assumption that this is a sort of downward slide of journalism towards, and when you unpick those terms, what featureization often means and what tabloidization often means is it's bringing in this rather more sort of human, less, you know, serious subjects treated in a kind of more personalized way. Maybe that's not so true of tabloidization, but featureization tends to imply that there's a kind of softening of the edges. It's less researched, it's less political, it's less likely to aid the sort of democratic process of engaging you in information. So actually,
Sorry, can I just ask you?
Yes, please do.
Aren't women more expected to write this kind of story than men? Doesn't it come out of that tradition in that, you know, features pages in the 70s and 80s suddenly started, or a lot more of them, and then men did news and women did this kind of stuff. Isn't that also part of the
Absolutely. I mean, one after another, you've picked up on, because Tim has pointed out that it did exist historically, and yes, very much, because actually I was going to say that I think some of the snobbery has to do with the fact that it's writing that's associated with women. Although, actually, I've shown...
I mean, those writers don't get invited to news conference in the mornings on big national newspapers in the same way that those conferences are dominated by blokes, isn't that right?
Absolutely.
Not on the Scotsman.
Okay.
So, yes, I think there is really a sort of an... you know, I think if you look at some of the writings about this, that there's a kind of argument that featurization very often means the emergence of those sort of women's themes and preoccupations. And it's very, as I say, although I've shown you a lot of the men, you know, Patrick Cockburn and what have you writing about it, it's very, very much often women, and particularly women who get slightly pressurized to write that kind of writing, which I'll mention. But actually, you know, I think some of the hostility comes from, or not hostility, but snobbery, so that, you know, yes, it's associated with women, and there is that residual sexism still present in news organisations. It's also that issues like objectivity are hard won, as you know, and not a concept that you'd want to give up. And if you look at some of the ways in which news has become more subjective, things like Fox News with this much more opinionated upfront, I think this, I think that, I don't. You know, those are kind of where opinion is being passed off as fact. You can see why there would be some reluctance to, you know, to kind of appear to let it go and, you know, kind of condone that kind of subjective writing becoming more and more present. I don't think anyone thinks it shouldn't exist. I think it's just that it tends to be sort of, sometimes when you hear it discussed, that's ring-fenced off as less serious and softer and not what journalism should really be about. But some of the, you know, I think there's also the issue, I mean, I've mentioned, thank you for bringing it up, the fact that it's associated with women, but there is some of this writing is very problematic. I mentioned Liz Jones and Samantha Brick at the beginning, but I also, just going back to, if you remember, I mentioned about the Living with Teenagers column. As I say, that was an anonymous column. I felt uneasy about it at the time because it included sort of details that I would never put in what I wrote, which I considered as slightly crossing the line. You know, on one occasion she wrote about she'd noticed her son had begun to sprout pubic hair, and I thought that was really crossing the line, because although it was anonymous, there was a lot of speculation amongst journalists about who do you think's writing this. It was very, very good writing, fantastically well written. And then, of course, it emerged that it was actually quite a well-known writer, Julie Meyerson. I won't go into all the details about how it emerged, and that her son was in quite serious trouble, had got in, you know, had, for various family conflicts, left home, was taking a lot of drugs. He then got into, he then put his side, he then put his side of the story, sold it to the Mail and the Sun. The parents came back with their story. It was kind of really horrendous, and as far as I know, you know, it's a sort of, things are slightly calmer, but it was a kind of wound created in the family that would be really quite difficult to heal. And interesting enough, I'd taken this sort of, my sister was very unhappy about me writing the column I did. She felt it was, I think quite wrongly, she thought it was washing dirty linen in public, I think was what she said at one point. It's all right, we've got over that now. But at least that wasn't quite as painful as the rupture here. But actually, I knew from the kind of responses I was getting from the column that I wrote that, you know, it really meant quite a lot to people. So I persevered, but eventually I found that quite difficult. Sorry, I will be very quick. I'm pretty well there. So actually, just to kind of, begin to move towards a conclusion, I do think there are problems with this kind of, with this writing. It can overstep the mark. It does attract, and I guess what I'm trying to argue is that it's present. It's an important part of journalism. I would defend it. I think it fulfills a very interesting function, but that it does have inherent dangers in it. And some of the dangers are here about transgressing onto writing about people from whom you don't properly have permission, like children and elderly parents, and that it can be very problematic. But I think it's a kind of form of journalism that's kind of come to stay. This more personalised, the identity of the writer being up at the forefront. I'm sure all of you are aware of this debate going on at the moment between BBC News and ITV News and the Tom Bradbury, that actually that is a much more personal style. He doesn't actually fall down. How he manages the tightrope, I don't know, but he doesn't quite fall down on the side of opinion, but it's a very casual, personalised discourse about, I know just when we thought it couldn't get any worse, it did, and you sort of have this character kind of coming at you, and it's clearly appealing, and you can see how much the websites that integrate these more personal, confessional, subjective kind of voices are very kind of appealing. But just to conclude, I think that, I've mentioned that I think there are dangers in it. And one of the dangers is this is, like, as I said, one is now approached a lot. The Mail has now got me marked out as someone who will write very personal pieces about looking after older people, and in fact they're just currently asking me if I would consider writing a personal piece about the death of my mother, which I'm very much in two minds about. But you can feel somewhat sort of I think, to come back to the point you made about women, there's an expectation on women writers now almost that they would do this kind of thing without a second thought, and I think that can be quite problematic. Having said that, this for me was one of the greatest pieces I've read in a long time. I don't know if any of you have already read it, but it was in the New Yorker, written by a journalist, a former journalist in his 90s, just about being old. And it is the most fantastic piece. I can't recommend it enough. I mean, if you want to know what it really is like to get old. And I happened to read that the same week that the Today programme had, that was last October, the Today programme talking about sort of old age and loneliness. And they had, what they did was they interviewed a 95-year-old widow about what he felt like and what it was like to be missing his wife and being old and not being able to get around. And not seeing people for days on end. And it was just so powerful. And actually, it was really interesting because it was, there were all the reports coming out about Ebola in Africa and all the terrible things that are happening in the Middle East. But actually, it was this personal voice that suddenly came out that really, that really grabbed you by the heart. So I think that there really is an important place for that, and I think it is part of this sort of more open culture that we live in. It is a more emotional time. We do have these, a lot of our media is concerned with examining the emotions, and I just want to conclude with there's a writer called, an American writer, Walt Harrington, who's written a book called Intimate Journalism, and he sort of sums up really what I want to say about it, which is in an era when people live harried, cynical and fragmented lives, far worse than we could have imagined only a few decades ago. A journalism that honestly and accurately evokes and describes the everyday lives and interior worlds is more than a strategy for selling papers. So, thank you. Okay, sorry. I realised, having said, please interrupt me, that I then delivered it like I was sort of delivering a thing, so apologies. So hopefully I haven't worn you all into the ground. Is there anything you'd like to? Yeah.
I wonder how you think social media has changed this game. With people live tweeting when they read a book, or live tweeting their births, or and it just doesn't become an issue if I'm putting my story out there, but I'm letting people participate, and it becomes a communication. If you think that's gonna change this, good or bad, I just wonder what your thoughts are.
Well, I'd be interested to know your thoughts. I mean, I think it's a very good point, because I think it's part of the same tendency, which is the ever more openness about our personal lives, and hence the reason why we've got into so many problems with what's private, what's not private, and how, that's still a kind of ongoing sort of issue, and people sort of, one minute they're putting their stuff out, and next minute they're saying, it's private, you can't use my stuff. But you were obviously making connections in your head with that.
Well, I was just thinking of a recent example of a guy from BuzzFeed who announced that he was going to buy the latest book in the 50 Shades of Grey series, and then live tweeted it throughout as he read it for 6 hours, and people kind of participated in it. And that was off the back of a lady in the US live tweeting her birth experience at home. And I just wonder if that also pressures journalists into writing stuff that they wouldn't normally want to, or if it makes such a spectacle of it that people are going to stop respecting the genre.
Yes, I mean, it's obviously slightly different, isn't it? Because these pieces tend to be a little bit more reflective, in the sense that you can go into the complexities of your feelings in a way that you probably can't if you're live tweeting. Someone, maybe you live tweet through your process of giving birth, but at the end of it, you might want to see the whole thing reflected on or made sense of. I don't know.
There's a fantastic example from the Washington Post along these lines of a story that they told in the paper, but just through the vehicle of Facebook updates from a woman who'd given birth and then terrible complications following it, and who subsequently died. It's agonising to read, but it's utterly compelling, of her updates and her husband and friends' updates as she's fighting for her life and eventually losing that battle, which I think perhaps reflects some of this a bit.
Yes.
More,
Well, it's very interesting. It's very interesting to me. I didn't know about that, or I hadn't thought about what you said either, but I'm just sort of flashing back to, I think I mentioned in the 80s, that was sort of, I was very trenchantly involved in feminist sort of theory and feminist ideas, and I was friendly with a photographer called Jo Spence. Again, I'm not sure if anyone's heard of her. She's having a bit of a revival, like all these people from that period are now having a bit of a revival, and people are interested. But she persuaded me to keep a record when I had a baby, to keep a record, a very, and her whole kind of thing was about exposing the reality of domestic labour. So she took a lot of pictures of women working in the home and what it was like, and tried to convey sort of boredom and things. So she'd take this graphic account, and which I obediently did. And now, of course, actually now I rather wish I'd gone for the idealised version, because this is something I keep well hidden, on a kind of hidden away. But so that kind of thinking, sorry, that's slightly over-personalised, oversharing of personal information there, probably.
I just wondered, when you were writing about your mum each fortnight, was there ever a worry that you didn't have anything to say for that particular week, and would you would you consciously think, let's organise a trip to the seaside so I've got something to write about? Would other people say things to you and then quickly ask you not to mention it? I just wondered to what extent it kind of impacted on your life day to day, rather than just kind of documenting your life,
Yeah.
the life of your mum. To what extent would it kind of influence it, perhaps?
Well, I think that's a fantastically good question. Yes, I never worried too much about not having anything to say because, life was so eventful at that point. She was constantly getting lost and disappearing or falling over, or there was another visit to the hospital. Or so it was, there was ongoing material, but it certainly began to impact. I was aware of collecting material, and that was one of the moments where I really began to feel uneasy. I thought, I'm actually predating on my own life in some way. But you've actually pointed out something that's really, really important, and I didn't have the opportunity to say, which is one of the things I really feel about this writing is I may have come over as sort of naively just saying, oh, it's wonderful. I do think some of it is really excellent, but I think one of the things that needs to be done is it needs to be recognised as a form of writing, just like other journalism is. So when we look at other forms of journalism and look for bias, or we look to see the hidden perspective or the hidden slant, we've all got quite sophisticated about that. We can recognise when material is being slanted and where bias is creeping in and how things are being left out and not left out. But funnily enough, with this kind of writing, because it's sort of it's not really coming up for critical scrutiny. It's treated almost as if it's the truth, just pouring out, that I just sat down and here's the truth of my week with my mother. But of course, you're quite right. Actually, it's narrative. What you're doing is assembling a narrative. And again, do any of you read the Guardian weekend, Tim Dowling? Yeah, every week. Because Tim Dowling, if ever there was someone who's not writing truth, he's writing like a sitcom. It's a sitcom, and here go the same.
How much of that stuff is made up? Particularly the Tim Dowling column, because I just think, how can he stay married to this woman? Who obviously, it's just constant complaints about him from everybody else in his family.
Well, yes, I completely agree. But I think, in my case, I've heard from someone that it's fairly accurate. But no, I think that, much more relevant is I think he writes a sitcom. I think it should be treated as a sitcom, which he bounces off his domestic life. And I think, I can honestly say I never made anything up about my mother, but I did occasionally rework, if a dialogue had happened in one place, I put it into where it was much more, I put them together. So I was creating, constructing. Yeah.
I wanted to link those two ideas together because one of the things I always felt about commissioning this kind of material, and I've written some of it myself, is that there is a real problem in the sense that there is no possibility of empirically verifying what is being said, that the source material is entirely subjective, and that there is always on the reader's mind the suspicion that some of it is invented to make it good. And as an editor, I often thought that I could tell, but I probably couldn't, but I was very well aware that some of it could be invented. And that was going to you talked about France and it not being done. Well, of course it is. It's done extensively. It's just not called journalism. Because they make precisely that distinction, that it's not empirically verifiable, therefore it's a different sort of narrative. It's storytelling. And I wonder, are you aware that there are cultures in which this kind of writing certainly is very prevalent, is very prominent in the public sphere? It simply isn't journalism, because that's not how it's described.
Well, I wasn't aware that that's how they saw it, because the kind of teaching I was doing was at one of the journalism schools in France, and they didn't put it to me like that, but I'm absolutely prepared to
you can
see that.
Think of lots of writing in France which we would think of as being confessional writing, which we would describe as journalism, but which is published in collections of fiction, short story, mixtures of fact and fiction, which become narratives. And certainly it wouldn't be taught in journalism school. It isn't. It's not published in
It's
newspapers.
like Michel Houellebecq, look at the map of the territory. It's a novel in essence, but it's actually quite autobiographical as well.
Yes.
So the French, I think, they disguise it in that.
Yes, I
The
suppose.
Americans as well. Joan Didion wrote a book about the death of her husband,
Yes.
Magical Thinking,
Yes.
how she mourned, and that has also elements of.
There are French journalists as early as the Spanish Civil War who were filing this sort of material back to their newspapers and they were told, very interesting, but this isn't reporting. You can't publish it here.
Well, you see-
It's easy for journalists to get into autobiographies sometimes, though. I mean, you've got Marion Keyes, who did the Under the Duvet one, didn't you? People who are journalists often do sometimes.
Oh, I'm not saying that journalists don't write it. I think they write it brilliantly. I'm simply saying that it's categorised in a different way in the public sphere in some places.
You see, Joan Didion is arguably a journalist, and I think Year of Magical Thinking is possibly my favourite book of all time, which I just think is wonderful. But, I guess we would never suspect John Simpson or Patrick Cockburn of, narrative, of inventing things for their... And I would say, I don't know whether the logic of what you're saying is we should do the same and we should drive a harder wedge, because...
I'm definitely not trying to say we should do anything. I'm just reflecting genuinely. I think, for example, correspondents do gild the lily to a certain extent.
Do what?
Gild the lily.
Gilt the lily.
Yeah.
But it's about if all the sources are anonymous, then you can't check anything. I mean, that's hugely different from somebody writing about identifiable people, isn't it? I mean, and also if there's if the right of reply doesn't come up, and in whatever form, then you'll never have that debate, and neither will anybody else most of the time, if they're anonymous sources.
But are you thinking about that in relation to the sort of Julie Meyerson
Yes, exactly.
eruption?
And Liz Jones has had lots of stories that have become other stories in their own right, because they've been taken up, as you say, by people.
Yes, by people who feel misrepresented and, badly treated. And yes, it's problematic. It's certainly there are certainly problems. And it was interesting with the Julie Meyerson thing that The Guardian then went, whoops, we don't have an editorial policy on this. We've been publishing this stuff, and she's been writing about her children who are, I think maybe the youngest was 13 or something. And then when it all erupted, and the people who were commissioning it must have known, they did know who it was who was writing it. They were obviously in league with her. But so they, when it erupted and went horribly wrong, then they said, look, we need a policy on this, which is that people must not write about. I can't remember what they formulated in the end, but it's still pretty wishy-washy. It's still not, it's still plenty of grey areas. Yeah.
You actually said a very interesting thing about personal journalism, which is reporting what's happening in private publicly, which is very interesting. But that's actually what journalists do. They try to find normal people to tell their personal stories all the time, even in conflict places and workers. So in this position, if you are telling your own story, your personal story, do we need journalists at all?
Well, a good question.
Anyone be?
Well, yes. The kind of logic of that some of these people, like Samantha Brick, I do believe Samantha Brick actually has no other claim other than she started writing these very personal pieces, almost like a blog. The truth is, you could be someone writing a blog whose blog is so grippingly revealing that, a newspaper like the Mail might come and say, yes, please, we'll have that. And in which case the whole kind of blurring of who is a journalist and who isn't, that they're not, I don't think that should undermine what you're doing here, because actually precisely for the reasons that we're talking about, these kind of ethical and formal kind of questions, actually do need to be handled. I think I'm arguing that the kind of ethical questions that come with this kind of writing need to be integrated to some extent into more journalism courses, because this kind of writing is becoming more and more widespread. And the sort of question that you were asking about Tim Dowling and narrative, and these are kind of real, they are issues, and I don't have any sort of set answers, but I'm beginning to think, these issues are going to become more and more prevalent. Actually, they're not going to go away. Yeah.
You said you had some very positive feedback writing about your experiences each fortnight, and I wondered whether that also shaped the content. If perhaps you had a number of letters that said, "I really liked it when you focused on this particular area." Would that, in future, then kind of draw you back towards those areas?
Yes.
Kind of discussions. I wondered whether it solved it kind of.
Yes.
Your readers tend to then kind of shape the work that you produce as well.
I mean, very much so, because and I even sometimes mentioned that someone had contacted me who'd said similar things. But yes, I think, it is kind of interesting, this whole feedback area. I mean, because I developed a much closer rapport with my readers than I'd ever done before. Okay, people used to feedback because it was just email only days, but when I was doing the column, I had an email address at the bottom and people would send emails. But this one got massive, I got masses more responses and people telling their own stories about it.
It's strange because as news reporters, we pretend we don't exist in the story.
That's
use that 350 words, but there's no mention of a byline perhaps, or a picture byline, but otherwise we don't exist. But actually the story wouldn't exist if it wasn't for us. So there's this strange kind of construction in that we're very, very involved in it because we produce the words, but equally we don't exist in the reader's mind.
No, that's absolutely...
It's the opposite of the kind of thing you just...
It is, and it's a bit schizophrenic, isn't it?
Yeah. Is that where journalism was going? Is the I as an I being replaced by an I as an I? Is that going to come in?
Very good. I think that's very good. Yeah. Do you mind if I just come back to the previous question? Because I think that's really interesting. And, it's reminded me, because I'm sort of looking at some of the feminist writing from the 70s and 80s, particularly on the women's page, and just going back to a bit of the history of The Guardian. Sorry to go on about The Guardian, but it happens to be the paper I know most about. But when Peter Preston, who was the previous editor to Alan Rusbridger, came in, he very much sort of saw that the way journalism was going. I always think he writes a column now in The Observer, and if you can wade through his muddy prose, he's always very intuitive and he's very good. But he says, when he's writing about it and things, that he saw that journalism was requiring this more sort of human presence, and that the readership was looking to sort of engage in a more, they wanted the sort of human and personal and domestic stuff covered. Having said that, he had a rather problematic relationship with the Women's Page, because the Women's Page sort of saw him as the male editor, but nevertheless he did kind of shelter it. And I've been looking at some of the writing on those pages, and it, although we take those things for granted now about writing about these personal things, at the time when those pages were putting them out, beginning to write about them, people like Jill Tweedy and Erin Pitsey writing about, she set up the women's refuges and things, they provoked a lot of negative feedback, not amongst the sort of readership of the pages itself, but a lot of people saying, look, this is not necessary, this is prurient, this is digging around, it's not what news should be reporting. It shouldn't be reporting on what's going on personally. This is personal stuff. So it didn't all just happen. It happened because people made a point of doing it and thinking it was important.
Can I ask you to reflect on something that others have suggested about this, which is that broadsheet newspaper readers were the slowest to come to a recognition which popular newspaper readers had reached 50 years earlier, which was that they were increasingly getting the facts about what was happening in the public sphere from radio and from television, and therefore what they wanted their newspaper for was something much more personal, much warmer, much more compelling. And the broadsheet audiences, I mean, you're talking about The Guardian doing something that maybe it's about the 1930s. You're right, the Guardian came to it brilliantly and did brilliantly from a family's perspective, and it only came to a recognition that the popular papers had come to years and years before, that their readers were now finding out what was happening in the world from the television screen, from the radio, and that they needed to do something which was compelling to hold their readership.
Yes.
Isn't that?
Yeah, no, I think that's got an element of truth. And I remember reading something Peter Preston said, which is, you know, the tabloids had got it right, and we weren't, you know, we needed to sort of respond. And I think that's right, that the papers, I mean, I've sort of said papers and websites, but I do think what's happening on the websites is slightly different, funnily enough, because although they've got, if you think of something like the Huffington Post, which is very I mean, it's very subjective in the sense it's very driven by a lot of opinion, and some of that opinion is very personalised, and it's got all the lifestyle blogs and the blogs and, you know, this and that. But so I think that there, you know, and I sort of argue in the book that the kind of push towards, you know, that a lot of the websites that are really succeeding are the ones that have got this strong presence. But then again, if you look at the Mail website, that's slightly different. It's got all the human interest stories, but it's not quite so driven by characters and subjective columns. You know, they've almost been downgraded on the website as opposed to the paper. But yes, I think that's true, and I think taking up from what you're saying, Tim, that you know, I think those sorts of where news is breaking fast all the time, and we've got other sources for it, and, you know, going back to your social media point, you know, there's that source as well. That actually this kind of journalism has a different role. You're right, you know, that it has a kind of, it is about sort of making sense of the human and the everyday and the personal, but that, you know, just sort of pointing out that's not humdrum or nothing or trivial, because actually we don't know where the next big, whereas, you know, where in the 80s, 70s, 80s, something like rape, people were saying, why are we discussing this? You know, this is not the subject of newspapers, but we don't know where the next thing is coming from. I mean, maybe it's mental illness, you know, which is now beginning to get an area.
Can personal journalism be fictional? Like you can create a fictional story and fictional characters and give advice or promote their goals?
No, I mean, as a general rule, completely not. You know, I mean, if anyone invents, there have been some scandals where, you know, people have invented, I can't remember his name, the one in America, Jason Burke or something, was it?
Yes.
Yeah, Blair, that's right, yeah. And who invented his interviewees, and that is a sackable offence, finished. And, you know, there's an unwritten sort of code, and which kind of comes back to the Tim Dowling question and your question. There's a sort of unwritten code, and I think actually what I think is that the news organisations like journalists writing this kind of stuff, because by and large they're signed up to a code that says you know, you don't lie, you don't invent, you try and tell the truth, you know, that, and actually I think that's why it's become such a big, you know, it's got a big presence in the newspapers, actually, on news organisations.
Don't you think organizations are more flexible with personal journalism than journalists?
In what way?
In like accepting greater margin of error?
Yeah, I think they do now. I think, but you mean accepting its presence? You don't mean accepting invention and lies and.
Not totally invention, but I know that they're reporting their own stories, the verification, their own perspectives. Yeah, their own perspectives. So they're subjective. So they're not objective like other journalists. They don't have to report the facts. They report it from their own point of view.
Yes, but I think there is...
Can we make this
Okay.
Okay.
I think there's a general acceptance that actually even doing this, if you're a journalist doing this kind of journalism, you stick to the facts, you don't invent. I think with Liz Jones, one of the things that hovered over her, for anyone who read the diaries, that for a while she had a rock star boyfriend. And there was a very strong, she used to refer to as RS, there was a very strong conviction amongst her readers and amongst journalists that she'd invented it. And then suddenly one week, oh, the rock star's out of my life, and here's somebody else with a real name. So there was a strong suspicion that she'd invented it. I think if anyone had found out that that was complete fabrication, in spite of it being this subjective journalism, in spite of it being personal, in spite of it being narrative, there is an expectation that people should tell the truth and that they shouldn't invent lies. And that's where the journalism, the authenticity of journalism comes into it, I think.
Some of my colleagues made the joke that had she been accused of inventing it, she'd have said that she sincerely believed it herself.
I suspect that's very true.